Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, so I think there are 47 people. I'm coming to take attendance. I'm about to take attendance. So those attendance is in the next 2 minutes. So those who are not in at the moment are deemed absent. I'm going to wait.
Yes, I think the information for the regular class didn't get there early, so some of them are still struggling to join.
Oh, struggling.
Yes, the link just dropped there, I think 1 minute ago.
Ah.
Yes.
Is it Thomas or which of them did?
No, so let's kindly exercise a little bit patient for them, like 5 minutes, and see how they can join.
All right, 5 minutes. All right, so we are going to start today looking at the anatomy of the eye and the associated structures, as we call adnexa. So it's going to form the basis of all that we'll be discussing in ophthalmology. What we're going to do is that for every topic or every condition that we take, we may do a review of the relevant anatomy before we start. So we'll start. So I've taken attendance. Those who are not on are absent. Okay. All right. So when we talk of the eye and adnexa, we are looking at the eyelids, the orbit. The orbit is the space in which we find the eye. The globe is the eyeball itself, and the extraocular muscles are the muscles that attach to the eye and help it to move. So when you're asked for all the following parts of the eye and adnexa, and I list these things and I mix it with something, you should be able to pick out which one is or is not part of this this part of the body. Okay, so start from the general external anatomy. So starting from the eyebrows, it marks the outer extent of the eyelids, all right? And they overlie the bony orbital rim. So when you pass your hand over your eyebrow and you palpate, you realize that it just marks the brim of what you call the orbit. The upper and lower eyelids open and close over the eye. And where both eyelids meet, what you call the canthus. So we have the left canthus and the right canthus, or more appropriately, the medial canthus and the lateral canthus. So if you are to define or explain what the canthus is, it is basically where the upper and lower eyelids meet. So there's one medial and there's one lateral. And the medial canthus has a small bump or mound near it that we call the caruncle. And if you look closely into your eye near the medial canthus, you see the let me get a pointer. Where's the pointer? Okay. All right. Can you all see my?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm trying to get a cursor to use. Cursor. Okay, all right. Can you see my cursor now? The red thing moving. Can you see it?
Yes, Doc.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. So the as I was saying, the medial canthus has a small projection on the mouth called the caruncle. We'll look at a picture of that briefly. Okay. Okay. So then the orbit. So as I said earlier, the orbit is the whole of the space in which we find the eye and its associated structures. Now the orbit, if you want to describe the shape, you'd liken it to a pear. And the stalk of the pear, or where the pear is attached to the tree, is where the optic nerve is attached from. And we would say that the eyeball itself, it occupies about 1/5 of the space, or 1/5 of the space that we call the orbit. And the rest of the space is occupied by the fat, muscle, and blood vessels, as well as nerves. The orbital septum forms the anterior limit and prevents spread of infection from the eyelid into the orbit. All right, so we'll look at all of these in picture shortly. Okay. All right, so still describing the space in which we find the eye, which we call the orbit. So it's the horizontal entrance has a width of about 40 millimeters. The vertical entrance is of about 35 millimeters. The total volume of the orbit is about 30 mils. All of these are multiple choice type of things, you know, so just pay attention to some of these values. Okay, and the distance from the back of the globe to the optic foramen. So that the distance from where the eyeball itself ends to where the optic nerve comes out of is also approximately about 18 millimeters. And the orbital segment of the optic nerve is 25 millimeters. That means that the distance from the optic foramen to the globe is about 25 millimeters. All right. Okay. So now this is a horizontal section of the globe. So where's my yes, so as we can see, this is the eye. Okay, looking forward, this is the cornea here. And this is also the cornea here. All right, so both eyes are looking forward, but you realize that the optic nerve behind each of them sort of converges at a point. Okay, so they converge at a point where we call the optic chiasma. Okay, now you realize that these lines here demarcate the orbit. So this whole cone, this cone here represents the orbit. This cone represents the orbit, okay? So this is one here, this is one there. Now you realize that the medial walls of the orbit are parallel. So this is one medial wall, this is another medial wall, and both of these are parallel to each other, okay? And then you realize that the lateral walls, this is the lateral wall, they will converge at an angle of about 45 degrees. So this is, if you are looking at this, what do you call it? This medial wall, the angle it forms with this lateral wall is about 45 degrees Celsius. All right. Okay, so basically that's what I want to say about this slide. And then these are the distances that I mentioned. Oops, sorry. Okay, so as I was saying, the orbital segment of the optic nerve is about 25 millimeters. The distance from the back of the globe to the optic nerve is 18 millimeters. All right, so we have about 24 millimeters here. We have the back of the globe to the optic rim is 18 millimeters. Okay. All right. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to look at are the relations of the orbit. Now, superiorly, the orbit is related to the frontal sinus. Okay, that's a frontal sinus. and inferiorly, the the orbit is related to the maxillary sinus. And medially, you have the ethmoidal sinus, and then the temporal aspects would be the temporalis fossa. So if you're asked for the relations of the orbit or the space in which we find the eyeball, this is what you, this is expected of you. So superiorly, you have the frontal sinus, inferiorly is the maxillary sinus, medially, we have the ethmoidal sinus, and temporally, we have or laterally, the temporal region is the same as the lateral region. It's related to the temporalis fossa. Okay. All right. Hey, why is my thing not moving when I want it? Okay. So now this is a CT scan that is demonstrating the orbit. So I'm sure you can all see the globe here or the eyeball here. This is one here, and there's another one here. Now, the diagram that I showed earlier, you realize that the medial walls of the globe are almost parallel. So this one medial wall, this another medial wall, realize that they're almost parallel. And then the lateral walls are converging. They would converge at a point here, which would be about 90 degrees, but the angle, the lateral wall of the globe forms with its medial wall is just about 45 degrees Celsius. All right. And yeah, so some relations, so this is a CT scan, as I said earlier. So some relations of it are that you realize that the ethmoidal bone, which we said is related to the medial aspect, is seen here. And some aspects of the sphenoid sinus is also showing on this CT scan. Now, so the orbit is made up of 7 bones. The orbit is made up of 7 bones. Now, the roof of the orbit is made up of the sphenoid and the frontal bone, the sphenoid and the frontal bone. We'll look at a picture of that shortly. The lateral wall is made up also by the sphenoid bone again and the zygomatic bone. The floor consists of the maxillary bone and the palatine bone and the zygomatic bones. The medial wall consists of the sphenoid bone, the maxilla, as well as the ethmoidal bones, and also the lacrimal bones and the supraorbital notch. All right. So this is a picture of it here. So the SON here is the supraorbital notch, and the F here is representing the frontal bone. I hope you can all see, this is the frontal bone. And behind the frontal bone or inside the frontal bone is the, what do you call it? Frontal sinus. So the frontal sinus will be somewhere here. And the frontal bone also extends, you see, it's forming a part of the superior wall. And the E here is the ethmoidal bone. L here is the lacrimal bone. M here is the maxillary bone. I mean, we've already described these. The sphenoid bone is seen here. And this is the zygomatic bone. And realize that's on the lateral border and a part of it extends into the orbit. All right, so all of these bones are forming the orbit. As I mentioned, we have the frontal here, we have the ethmoidal, we have the lacrimal, we have the maxillary, we have the sphenoid, we have the zygomatic. Great. Okay, so this is for emphasis as we are having here. Okay, so the roof, as I said, is made up of parts of the frontal bone and part of the sphenoid bone, as we saw over there. And then the lateral wall is also the strongest part of the bony orbit, which is the zygomatic bone. And then also a part of the sphenoid bone. The floor also turns out to be the weakest area. Okay, so, well, not the very weakest, because the ethmoidal bone is much, much thinner. But it's been found out that the floor is more vulnerable to blowout fractures. When we get to trauma, we'll discuss the injuries into further detail. Then so the floor is made up of the maxillary bone, part of the zygomatic bone, and the palatine bone. The medial wall, as I just mentioned, is the thinnest part of the orbit. And this therefore allows it to easily let infections cross in from the sinus into the orbit. So typically, when people have sinusitis, okay, pansinusitis, for instance, and it's not treated properly, you realize that it can, the bacteria can move from there into the orbit. Yes. All right. So as I said earlier, the ethmoidal bone is it's a very thin bone, which is able to allow that. And we have the frontal bone, lacrimal bone, and the maxillary bone all formed in the medial wall. So I can pose the question, which of these bones is not found in the lateral wall of in the medial or the lateral wall or the whatever wall of the orbit? Then I'll write sphenoid, I'm writing frontal and all of that. Then you have to be able to choose the one that is not part of the medial or whatever wall the question is asking. Okay, now when we talk of the orbital apex, as I mentioned from the beginning, the orbit is like a pear, okay, and the apex of it is where the pointed or the stalk is connected to. All right, so the apex, the orbital apex is where the converging point of the orbit. Now, the orbital apex is the entry point of all blood vessels and nerves that come to the eye. It is the entry point of all blood vessels and nerves that come to the eye. And it is also the origin of all extraocular muscles except, so you realize that teacher for the near the except entities. So it is the orbital apex is the point of entry of all blood vessels and nerves that come to the eye. And it's also the origin of all the extraocular muscles except the inferior oblique. All right. So if you see this in the exam, it's simple, isn't it? All right. The optic canal carries the optic nerve and the ophthalmic artery. The optic canal carries the optic nerve and the ophthalmic artery. We'll look at the picture shortly. The superior orbital fissure carries most of the vessels and nerves supplying the extraocular muscles and other structures in the orbit. So basically, the optic canal, as stated here, and the superior orbital fissure are the main apertures that you find in the orbital apex. So here we are differentiating what you will find in each of them. So we are saying that the orbital apex, all right, it is the point of entry for all the vessels and nerves, and also for all the extraocular muscles, except the inferior oblique. Now, the main entry point, the reason why the orbital apex, the entry point, is because of the presence of the optic canal and also the superior orbital fissure. And I'm saying that the optic canal, it carries the optic nerve and the ophthalmic artery. And the superior orbital fissure carries most of the vessels and nerves supplying the extraocular muscles and other structures in the orbit. Okay. All right. Oh, I had a picture somewhere. Okay, we'll get to the picture shortly. Yes, so the next thing we want to look at is the eyelids. So the eyelids, each eyelid is divided into an anterior and a posterior layer. And we term these layers, this anterior and posterior layers, the lamellae. One is lamella, all right? So the anterior lamella, okay, the eyelid is divided, I said, into anterior and posterior layers, which each is a lamella. So both anterior and posterior refer to them as lamellae, okay? Now, the anterior lamella includes skin and orbicularis oculi muscle. Okay, which of these structures make up the anterior lamella of the eyelid? All right, A, so and so. B, Kofi and Ama. C, Ama and Menu. You should be able to pick it out easily, isn't it? Yes. So you can see that even though the exams is always easy, those who don't come to class, they will feel put off anyway. So, so yes, basically, I mean, most of the time when I'm teaching, all the questions I'm likely to ask, you most likely hear them throughout the lecture. So if you are paying attention and you're in class, you shouldn't be struggling with exams, you see. Okay. Now, so a thin multilayered septum separates the anterior preseptal tissues from the post-septal orbital structures. So we are saying that in between the anterior and the posterior layers of the eyelid, you'd have a septum that separates them, okay? So the posterior lamella, in this case, includes the tarsus and its attachments and the condyles. Hello? All right. So as I was saying, the posterior lamella includes the tarsus, okay? It's a more of a connective tissue in there, and its attachments and the conjunctiva. We'll get into more details to get clearer soon. Now, the upper and lower eyelid retractor muscles have attachments onto the tarsus. So what you're saying is that the tarsus is the connective tissue that is found in the posterior lamella, and the muscles that cause the eyelids to open and close, which referred to as the retractor muscles, are attached onto this tarsus. I hope that is clear. All right. So this is a little topography here. So this is the eyeball. Said that the eyebrow here is lying over the superior orbital rim. And the point where the eyelid is attached, when the eye is closed, you can see there's a depression here. And that is called the superior palpebral crease. And over here also, we have a similar one down here, also known as the inferior palpebral crease. Now, when we are judging the severity of dehydration, when we talk of the sunken eyes that we've been talking about, what we actually see is a prominence of the palpebral creases. Okay, so when someone becomes dehydrated, they are seeing sunken eyes. It's the creases, the superior palpebral crease and the inferior palpebral crease that become more prominent. All right, and that is due to dehydration in the tissues. They lose much of their water and then they lose their mass, and it causes us to have what we call the sunken eyes. Okay, so that is the clinical relevance of these the palpebral creases. Okay. What's the other
we have less than 2 minutes for the first session to end. The time is counting down at the top.
Okay. Oh, okay. Because you spend the time waiting for the others.
Yes, Doc.
How long is each session?
40 minutes, I think. Yes.
I see. All right. Okay. So then so we can close and rejoin again, isn't it?
Yes, Doc. Yes, please.
All right, then let's do that.
All right, Doc.